the first wonder for the mandatories, PT, will one Fletcher Cox be in attendance at the mandatories?
Fletcher Cox, Darren Sproles, right?
I would think Sproles would be there, but will Fletcher Cox find it necessary to be at the mandatories? Now, that would be the first crack. Now, you remember last year, you were waiting to find out who would blink between Chip Kelly and Evan Mathis. Mathis said he would come.
On a plane somewhere, right?
Well, Mathis said he was planning on coming. Kelly never gave him the opportunity. Now, the Eagles aren't going to cut Fletcher Cox, that's for sure. But will he force them to really start to get worried? Do you think they get worried if he doesn't show up? You know, do they start to worry about a holdout? I don't know that they will get to that. We'll ask John, 97.3 ESPN.com's John McMullen. We'll take a look at the 3-day camp that just came to a close today and get any news and notes that happened up there. But how about that predicament, John? Do you think that Fletcher will be here when the mandatories start?
I do, but I will say that if he's not, I think then it becomes a story, because we've talked about it in the past. Why aren't people upset about Fletcher not being here? The hypocritical nature of calling out Sam Bradford for missing some voluntary work and not calling out Fletcher Cox. So all of those stories I've kind of downplayed because I don't believe they're a big deal. But if he doesn't show up for mandatory minicamp, then it becomes a big deal. Then it becomes a story, and then it's going to be an issue moving forward, and it is a possible holdout in training camp if nothing gets done. All that said, I do believe that Fletcher will be there for the mandatory work.
Yeah, no, I guess all the indications are that he would be there, but I guess just kind of previewing that 2 weeks from now, and if he's not there, whether the Eagles start to feel a little pressure at all. Would he be willing to take that chance to start getting fined to try to put the pressure on them?
You never know. You never say never, because from a player's perspective, you don't have a ton of leverage in these types of situations. And that's one of the few things he has at his disposal. So it's always a possibility, but because it's the team option year, his 5th year on his rookie deal, Fletcher is scheduled to make a lot of money this year. So it's not like he's tremendously underpaid as, say, a 4th or 5th round pick that has developed into an all-pro player. He was a first-round pick, and he's getting paid as such. So I don't know if it's going to be worth it for him to take those fines that you would have, especially for training camp. But starting in the mandatory work at minicamp, and that's part of it. And I expect him to show up for those 3 days and then leave and come back at training camp. And all the while, both sides are trying to work something out long-term behind the scenes.
John McMullen's with us, 97.3 ESPN.com. All right, John, I don't know how much you guys were able to see. What are you allowed? The first day they kind of open things up and then shut you out the next 2?
Yeah, first day, Tuesday, it's opened up, and then the next 2 were shut out. Next week, they have 2 days open. So it'll be Tuesday and Friday, I believe, which will be the last phase of the OTAs. And then the minicamp, which is 3 days. Every minicamp practice is open. So we'll get to see a lot more over the next couple of weeks and how things are starting to sort of shake out and develop.
So over these 3 days, really that first day is when you get to see some things, and then after that you guys are just kind of picking the brains of some of these guys, and then, of course, you had the chance to hear from Jim Schwartz. Over the 3 days, we know what Frank Reich said the other day, but other than that, what was the standout of this group of OTAs?
Well, I think it was defensively, because Jim spoke for the first time since he's been hired, really. So I think that was the main phase of everyone's attention. And because there's a significant shift going on, and obviously the move from a 3-4-2 gap defense to a 4-3 attacking defense, and they had some hiccups on Tuesday at practice. A lot of it was that they were looking at younger players in bigger positions for the first time, but there was a number of offsides, just a general sloppiness, which Jim acknowledged, and it wasn't a good day for a lot of people. And it's early in the process, and part of it is just the drastic change, but that's going to be something to keep an eye on as we march toward training camp.
John, I read your article about undrafted free agents and the money the Eagles spent on those guys. Anyone the listeners should particularly keep an eye on?
Yeah, I wrote about the 5 guys that I think are most likely to make the team. The Eagles spent more money on undrafted free agents than any other team in the NFL, and almost $200,000 more in signing bonuses, and that is a big gap if you understand the undrafted free agent system. Basically, $10,000 or so is a big signing bonus for an undrafted free agent. The Eagles gave over $100,000 to Darrell Green, who's an offensive guard. They gave over $90,000 to Mike Tavares, who's a linebacker. So that tells you what they think of those 2 guys specifically. Green, though, I think he's in a numbers crunch because they've added so much on the offensive line, not only in the draft where they took Sayamalu in the 3rd round and Vaitai in the 5th round, but also through free agency. They signed Brooks and they signed Wisniewski. So he might face a bit of a numbers crunch, whereas Tavares is at a position that if he shows anything at outside linebacker, he's going to have a really, really good chance to make this team.
And I see you listed John DePalma on there as a long snapper. People just kind of automatically pencil in John Dorenbos, but why does John DePalma make sense?
Well, John is 35 years old, John Dorenbos. So at the time, even at a position at long snapper, there's a couple things that come into it. Not only the age, but also the salary. As you get higher in the level, obviously in veteran in the NFL, your salary keeps going up, and that's at a position that if you can get a young guy in who can do it consistently, you can save a little bit of money, and you can be set up for the next decade or so. The second part is John sort of had a downtick in his play last year. He wasn't nearly as consistent as he had been in the past. So DePalma's another guy they gave significant money to, especially for a long snapper who wasn't drafted. He got $10,000 in guaranteed money. So that really puts the antennas up and shows you that the Eagles are thinking that he's going to be significant competition for John Dorenbos.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of goes over to the Sturgis and what's his name, Parkey coming back this year. So you could have a new a new kicking snap, whole different special teams situation this year. Which I think that kicking thing, we're talking about a kicker, but is a little under the rug a little bit because Sturgis got off to a bad start, but actually kicked pretty good down the stretch. We all know Parkey's story kind of came out of nowhere, 2 years ago. So that should be something pretty interesting there as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, and really most of it, depends on how healthy Cody Parkey is. Because if you go back that 2 years, he kicked at an all-pro level. He was one of the best 2 or 3 kickers in football. That's how good he was. And even though you're right about Sturgis, and he did kick a lot better, and he kicked very well as a whole down the stretch, it was nowhere near Cody Parkey from the year prior. So their hope is he's 100% healthy, and if he is, he'll be the kicker of this team. But that's a big if, because if you remember Parkey before he was shut down for the season with the sports hernia, the core muscle injury, he was not kicking well. And hopefully it was due to the injury and solely due to the injury. But that's going to be something. He's not kicking at 100% right now. He's not going full bore. So that's something that's not going to shake out until August at the earliest. And I think most of it depends on the health of Cody Park.
John, Marcus Smith, does he look more confident? Can you tell he's more confident, more mature this year?
Yeah, I think he's a lot more confident, and I think Jim Schwartz kind of talked about what he tries to do as a defensive coordinator, and it speaks a lot. He wasn't speaking about Marcus specifically, but it'll help a player like him. And that he said our job is as coaches is to make a complicated game simple for the players, and that's Jim's philosophy. And for Marcus Smith, someone who struggled obviously mightily in his first 2 seasons, to go from a 3-4 outside linebacker where he has so much on his plate as far as whether on certain plays he's rushing the passer, he's dropping into coverage, he's got to stuff the run. In certain instances, all of a sudden, he's now a 4-3 defensive end, and Jim Schwartz is going to ask him to go after the quarterback. So for him, it's going to be much simpler. I think that's going to enable him to play faster. And he still has a lot of physical gifts. I know people laugh at that, but if you look at him, he certainly looks the part. He's got tremendous speed. He's always needed to add strength, and he seems to have done that in the weight room over the last couple of years. So I would not write him off just yet. I think with Jim Schwartz, he might turn into I'm not going to say a valuable player, but a part of the rotation that could help you and at least give you 20 effective snaps every Sunday or so.
But with all that you just said, there is a lot of competition at that position, so could you also see him being a candidate of somebody that gets cut?
I don't think so. By the way things are lining up, because if you look at how things are, it's definitely going to be Connor Barwin, Brandon Graham, Vinny Curry. They're going to be the top 3 defensive ends. But after that, he's, mainly been lined up on the left side behind Vinny Curry. And Alex McAllister has been the 3rd-string guy. He's a 7th-round pick. And if you see Alex, he's 6'6" and 239 pounds. He looks like a wide receiver playing defensive end. He's just not ready to play in the NFL physically right now. So I think when you look at the Eagles' plans for him, it's going to be to stash him on practice squad for a year and hope he can develop in the weight room. So I think Marcus has got a pretty easy route for making this roster this year.
I want to say just on defense, John, and Marcus is a big name by draft position. First round, obviously. But are there guys that have bigger names on the defensive side of the ball that you look at in these OTAs and start to say, let's do the calculations here. Man, this guy could be in some trouble.
I don't know if it's big names, but there's certain veterans you can look at and say this guy's in trouble. Taylor Hart being most notably, certainly not a big name, but he was a 5th-round pick, and he was always a guy Chip Kelly protected, and I just don't see him fitting in anywhere on this particular defense. They don't have many veteran players at linebacker, so even though I question whether a Michael Kendricks is going to be anything that people expect, because everyone kind of looks at Michael and says, all right, you can count on him, but I've never really seen that. It's just been sort of a guy who's tremendously explosive and physically gifted, but that's never really translated to the field. But while I say that, there's no one pushing him because there's no depth. And at cornerback is a similar situation. The young guys are going to be pushing for work, most notably Jalen Mills, but they're not going to push out a Nolan Carroll or a Leotis McKelvin or even an Eric Rowe, who's a second-year guy. So the veterans are pretty much in good shape because there's such a lack of depth on this defense as a whole.
Seems like there's a lot of corners, as you just mentioned, and there's a lot of competition there. It seems that a good player is going to get squeezed out, or a player, maybe not a good player, but a player that we talk a lot about between now and, when they start the preseason. You just mentioned you got Brooks, McKelvin, Carroll, Rowe, Ja'Cory Shepard, Mills. There's another, what's the kid from Auburn? Countess. There's a lot of players, yeah. Right? You got a lot of guys competing there. There's got to be a couple of odd men out.
Yeah, there is, and you start looking at the Countess has been mainly lining up at safety, so they're going to try him there first. And Mills is lined up exclusively at corner. the one guy, Ja'Cory Shepherd, is not 100%. So these OTAs are more important for younger players than they are for veteran players, obviously. And when you look at a guy like Ja'Cory, I think it's more important in the fact that he's missing more work because he's not completely healthy. It's understandable why. I think all of a sudden it becomes more difficult for him when he gets to training camp because there are guys that are standing out. Mills so much that Jim Schwartz decided to put him on the first team the other day. So that can tell you, Jim can talk about not having depth charts all he wants, and I understand that. I get that. But it tells you that he thinks he might have something in Jalen Mills, and if a guy like that is earmarked to be, whether it's a starter or a sub-package player, that makes it much less likely that a Ja'Cory Shepherd's going to make this team.
Yeah, and Mills, you're right about, because I read over the Jim Schwartz transcripts probably about 4 or 5 times, and it was pretty interesting. You kept finding new things in there. And one thing that I kept finding is he kind of singled Mills out. I mean, he mentioned something about him that they like him playing out on an island, that he's very athletic. And it seems of all the guys, besides the safeties, that Mills was one guy. He was like, well, look, he was like, let's not go overboard. But so it seems that Mills is a guy that going into training camp has a little bit of a leg up on some of these guys. I want to flip over, John, to offense and ask the same question. Which veteran players are in some trouble here? I wouldn't imagine. I would assume that the wide receiver spot, there's going to be some interesting names. And then maybe across the offensive line is where you're going to start to see some of the more recognizable names that you're about to bring up.
Yeah, and offensive line, you have to look at Andrew Gardner, who got an extension from Chip Kelly in the old regime, and then got hurt with the Liz Frank injury. He's been lining up as a third-team left tackle, so you have to think things are going to be really, really difficult. When I mentioned earlier with Pete, they've added so much on the offensive line as far as young players. Sam Ollie's going to make the team. Vaitai's going to make the team. Obviously, Brooks is going to make the team as the high-priced free agent. Wisniewski's likely going to make the team. And all of a sudden, you have a numbers crunch, and a guy like Andrew Gardner is probably on the outside looking in. At wide receiver, I think it's going to be interesting. And that piece I wrote for 973ESPN.com, I said the second most undrafted free agent likely to make this team is Caleb Jones, who's a big 6'3" wide receiver from Arizona. And one of the reasons why is because if you look at these veterans they brought in, Randall obviously out with the gallbladder surgery. He'll be back. I expect him to make the team. But when you talk about a Givens and even a Josh Huff, it's going to be difficult for those guys because if you're going to be the 4th or 5th or 6th receiver, if they keep 6 on a roster, you have to help on special teams. And that's where guys like Jones, if he can do something as far as that aspect of the game as a young player, they might say, hey, let's keep the young guy with upside and just walk away from the veteran.
John McMullen's with us, 97.3ESPN.com. You can check out his 5 undrafted free agents who he thinks have the best shot to make the team over at 97.3ESPN.com. John also covers the league nationally for today's pigskin.com, and you can give him a follow on Twitter at JFMcMullen, John. So we'll throw a couple NFL questions out there at you. The one that I find interesting is you got like a seance happening in New York where the Jets receivers are like, you know what, you don't want a quarterback? We're not going to show up to practice here. It seems like this is starting to trickle down now to some skill players on that team that they're not happy.
Yeah, and I wrote about that today, and I said, instead of Occupy Wall Street, it's Occupy Forum Park because guys aren't showing up to play. And obviously, look, Brandon is a great receiver. He's been great no matter where he's gone. But even he likes Ryan Fitzpatrick. Eric Decker put up phenomenal numbers, so all of a sudden these guys are staying away from OTAs and protests. And remember, they are voluntary, as we say here with Philadelphia. So it's not technically a holdout, but they're trying to send a message. And, OTAs might not be important for veteran players, and that's true, and guys like Marshall and Decker and even Fitzpatrick can hit the ground running if they just show up for training camp. But if you're the Jets as a whole, who were 60 minutes away from the playoffs last season, you're obviously behind the eight ball. There are 31 other teams in the NFL that are trying to build a foundation to win this season, and they got most of their players in there, and they're humming all along, and you don't have your quarterback or your two top wide receivers. You start to ask yourself, what are you even getting accomplished in these types of things? And it's becoming silly. Mm-hmm. If the Jets have if they don't want Ryan Fitzpatrick, they should say, hey, look, Geno Smith's going to be our starter. Christian Hackenberg is the heir apparent. Let's move forward. But the way they're handling things, it's bad business. It really is.
Right, and they also drafted Bryce Petty last year, so you would think that, and I know they've kind of said, maybe he's not ready, but you're right. Maybe give one of these guys the feeling that, hey, one of you guys can win this job. We're not really worried about the guy who's not here right now, but they're not doing a great job of making that apparent. Last question for you, John, which we were laughing kind of a little bit about this before the show, which was the Ravens had to forfeit 1 week of OTAs because they got caught wearing pads. And my question was, would teams rather have 1 week of having the pads on and forfeit the extra week of the OTA? In other words, would they rather have less OTAs if they were allowed to wear the pads for a few days?
Well, coaches certainly would. There's no question about it. And I think you might be on to something as far as John Harbaugh goes, because if you think about the experience he has, he knows the rules. It's not a surprise to him that you can't put on pads in off-season work. So I think you might hit the nail on the head. And he said, these things aren't that important anyway. We can get more out of breaking the rules and losing the extra week and then just showing up to training camp where you can put on pads. But the collective bargaining agreement, that's one of the things the players fought for really hard. And when people talk about how slanted that was for the owners as a whole, they don't realize how much the players got as far as scaling back off-season work. And it starts with that no pads rule, and it's very, very important. So obviously the coaches think a lot different than the players in that aspect of it.
John McMullen has more on the Eagles OTAs at 97.3ESPN.com and at JF McMullen on Twitter. John, have a good one, pal.
Thank you, guys.